There is a land at the crossroads of civilization. A land that gave the world its first declaration of human rights. A land of poets, mathematicians, mystics, and conquerors. It is a land that has been invaded, burned, and rebuilt more times than almost any other on Earth. And yet it endures. This is Iran. And its story is not just one of tragedy. It is a story of a people who have never stopped reaching for something greater, even when the world, and sometimes their own rulers, tried to stop them. But tragedy? Yes, there is plenty of that too. This is the story of Iran, from the heights of the Persian Empire to the turbulence of today. To understand the tragedy of Iran, you first have to understand what Iran was. Thousands of years before Rome, before Greece reached its golden age, people were building complex societies on the Iranian plateau. The Elamites built cities at Susa around 4000 BCE. Trade routes crossed this land. Writing developed here. Kings rose and fell. But it was around 550 BCE that everything changed, and one man changed it. Cyrus the Great. Cyrus founded the Achaemenid Persian Empire, and within a generation, it became the largest empire the world had ever seen, stretching from the shores of the Aegean Sea to the borders of India. But Cyrus was different from other conquerors. When he captured Babylon, one of the great cities of antiquity, he didn't slaughter the population. He freed the enslaved peoples. He let them return to their homelands. He allowed them to worship their own gods. On a clay cylinder now housed in the British Museum, he declared, "I am Cyrus, king of the world." And then, remarkably, he promised his subjects peace. This was the Cyrus cylinder, widely considered one of the earliest charters of human rights in recorded history. For a brief, extraordinary moment, Persia was the center of the civilized world. Art flourished. Architecture soared. The royal road connected the empire. Trade made cities wealthy. Then came the Greeks. Then came Alexander. In 330 BCE, Alexander the Great swept through Persia and burned Persepolis, the ceremonial capital of the empire, to the ground. Some historians say it was revenge. Others say it was an accident fueled by wine and a woman's suggestion. Whatever the reason, the seat of Persian power was ash. But here is the first great lesson about Iran. You can burn the capital. You cannot burn the identity. The Persians endured under Macedonian rule. And when Alexander's empire fractured after his death, Persia reasserted itself under the Parthians and then the Sassanid Empire, arguably the greatest Persian civilization of the ancient world. The Sassanids ruled for over 4 centuries. They built grand cities. They developed Persian art, architecture, and literature into high sophistication. Zoroastrianism, an ancient monotheistic faith native to Iran, became the state religion. Their empire rivaled Rome and then Byzantium. But the empire was exhausted by centuries of warfare with Rome. And to the south and west, a new force was gathering. In the 7th century CE, the Arab Muslim armies swept north. In 651 CE, the last Sassanid emperor was murdered. Persia, the great empire, was gone. And Islam arrived. The Arab conquest of Persia is one of the most consequential events in world history. And yet, it did not erase Persia. It transformed it. The Iranians adopted Islam, but they were not passive about it. Over generations, they became some of the most sophisticated scholars, scientists, poets, and administrators in the Islamic world. Persian became the lingua franca of Islamic culture, the language of poetry, philosophy, and diplomacy from Turkey to India. The names tell the story. Ibn Sina, known in the West as Avicenna, who wrote a medical encyclopedia that was used in European universities for centuries. Al-Khwarizmi, whose work on mathematics gave us the word algorithm. The poet Rumi, whose verses are still read around the world today. This was the Persian Renaissance inside the Islamic Golden Age. A people conquered, yet somehow shaping the civilization of their conquerors. And crucially, the Persians leaned into Shia Islam, which would separate them from the Arab Sunni world and define Iranian identity to this day. But then, once more, destruction came from the east. In 1220, Genghis Khan invaded the Persian heartland. What followed was arguably the greatest single catastrophe to befall Iranian civilization. The Mongols didn't just conquer, they annihilated. Cities that had stood for centuries were leveled. Libraries were burned. Irrigation systems that had sustained agriculture for millennia were destroyed. Nishapur, one of the great cities of the medieval world, was slaughtered so completely that historians say the Mongols stacked skulls in pyramids outside its walls. Historians estimate that the Mongol invasions killed perhaps a third of the Iranian population. Some estimate even more. It took generations for Iran to recover. And when it did, it was under the Timurids, successors who had themselves adopted Persian culture, a pattern that was becoming familiar. You can conquer Iran, but Iran somehow always absorbs its conquerors. In 1501, a teenage Shah named Ismail I rode into the city of Tabriz and declared something radical. Iran would now be officially Shia Muslim. This was more than a religious decree. It was a declaration of identity. In a Sunni Muslim world dominated by the Ottoman Empire to the west, Shia Iran would stand apart, distinct, sovereign, and proud. The Safavids built one of the most beautiful empires in history. Isfahan, their capital, became a jewel of the world. The great Shah Abbas I created a city of turquoise domes, soaring minarets, and grand bazaars that stunned European visitors. It was said, Isfahan is half the world. Persian culture reached new heights. Carpet weaving, miniature painting, poetry, and architecture flourished. The Safavids also built a professional military, a bureaucracy, and a complex court. But the empire was always under pressure, from the Ottomans to the west, the Uzbeks to the north and east, and eventually from European powers increasingly interested in Persian trade routes. By the 18th century, the Safavids had collapsed. Afghanistan rose in rebellion. Warlords carved up the country. And then came a brief, brutal interruption. Nader Shah, a military genius who conquered from India to the Caucasus, but whose paranoia turned him into a monster. He was assassinated by his own guards in 1747. Iran fractured again. By the 19th century, Iran was caught in one of the most humiliating geopolitical traps in its history. Squeezed between the British Empire expanding from India and the Russian Empire pushing south. The Qajar Shahs who ruled Iran were weak, corrupt, and easily manipulated. They sold concessions, mining rights, trade rights, even the exclusive right to sell tobacco, to British and Russian companies, enriching themselves while impoverishing the country. In 1872, Shah Nasser al-Din sold almost every economic resource of Iran to a single British businessman, Baron Julius de Ruyter. Even the British press was scandalized. Ruyter himself called it the most complete surrender of a country's resources to foreign hands he had ever seen. But the Iranian people were not passive. The tobacco protest of 1891, a nationwide boycott organized with astonishing coordination by clerics and merchants, forced the Shah to cancel the tobacco concession. It was a sign of things to come. In 1905 and 1906, a constitutional revolution swept Iran, one of the first in Asia. Iranians demanded a parliament, a constitution, limits on royal power. They got them briefly. But the British and Russians, alarmed by a democratic Iran that might actually control its own resources, moved to undermine it. The two empires formally divided Iran into spheres of influence in 1907. The constitutional experiment was crushed with foreign help. The lesson was burned into the Iranian consciousness. The outside world would always intervene to keep Iran weak. In 1921, a military officer named Reza Khan seized power and in 1925 declared himself Reza Shah Pahlavi, founder of a new dynasty. His project was modernization, rapid, forced, and often brutal. He built railways, universities, and modern courts. He mandated Western dress. He ordered women to remove the veil. He suppressed tribal leaders and religious authorities alike. He envisioned Iran as a strong, secular nation-state. But he was a dictator, and his rule was harsh. During World War II, Britain and the Soviet Union, suspicious of Reza Shah's neutrality and possible German sympathies, invaded Iran and forced him to abdicate in 1941. They installed his young son, Mohammad Reza, on the throne. And then came the moment that defines modern Iranian-Western relations more than any other. Oil. Iran had oil, enormous, world-changing quantities of it. And it was being pumped out of the ground almost entirely for the benefit of the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, a British corporation, while Iranians received a fraction of the profits. In 1951, the Iranian parliament voted to nationalize the oil industry. The man who led the charge was the democratically elected Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh. He became a hero across the developing world, the leader who dared to say, "This is our oil." Mossadegh was not a radical. He was a Swiss-educated aristocrat, a constitutionalist, a democrat. He wept in parliamentary sessions. He received foreign leaders in his pajamas. He seemed, to many Iranians, like someone from another era, someone decent. But to Britain and the United States, he was a threat. Britain imposed a devastating embargo on Iranian oil. The U.S., under President Eisenhower, worried about Soviet influence in Iran and the domino theory. In August 1953, the CIA and British intelligence executed Operation Ajax, a covert operation to overthrow the democratically elected government of Iran. It worked. Mossadegh was arrested. The Shah, who had briefly fled the country in a panic, returned in triumph on an American-funded wave. The U.S. government would not officially acknowledge its role for decades. But Iranians knew. They always knew. The Shah resumed power and, with American support, ruled as an increasingly authoritarian monarch. His secret police, SAVAK, were feared throughout the country. Political opponents were tortured, jailed, executed. There was modernization, women in universities, land reform, industrialization. But there was no freedom. And there was no forgetting 1953. By the 1970s, resentment had reached a boiling point. The religious establishment, led by the exiled cleric Ayatollah Khomeini, was organizing. Leftists, liberals, nationalists, and Islamists found themselves united by one thing: hatred of the Shah. In 1979, the Shah fled. Khomeini returned to Iran to a crowd of millions. The revolution had succeeded. But what came next was not what the liberals and leftists had imagined. The 1979 Islamic Revolution was one of the most shocking political events of the 20th century. Few analysts predicted it. Even fewer understood what it would become. Khomeini introduced the concept of Vilayat-e-Faqih, the guardianship of the Islamic jurist, meaning clerics would hold supreme political authority. It was a radical theological innovation with no precedent in traditional Islamic governance. The liberals who had supported the revolution were outmaneuvered. The leftists were crushed. By the early 1980s, thousands of political opponents had been executed, often after cursory trials, in what became known as the prison massacres of 1988. And then, just 1 year after the revolution, Saddam Hussein's Iraq invaded. The Iran-Iraq War lasted 8 brutal years, from 1980 to 1988. It was World War I-style warfare with modern weapons: trenches, poison gas, human wave attacks. Iran sent young men and boys to the front with keys around their necks, told they were the keys to paradise. By the time it ended, an estimated 500,000 to 1 million people were dead. Iran had fought to a standstill, with its borders essentially unchanged. Khomeini, in a famous statement, compared accepting the ceasefire to drinking poison. He died the following year. Iran was exhausted, isolated, and governed by a clerical establishment that had shown it would tolerate no dissent. After Khomeini's death, Iran entered a complicated, contradictory era. The Islamic Republic remained authoritarian, but it also allowed elections, debates, and competing factions within the system. In 1997, a moderate cleric named Mohammad Khatami won the presidential election in a landslide. Iranians, especially the young, voted for reform, for openness, for engagement with the world. For a moment, it seemed possible. Newspapers multiplied. Civil society stirred. Discussions about democracy, women's rights, and human rights entered the public sphere. But the supreme leader, Ali Khamenei, and the conservative establishment pushed back. Newspapers were shut down. Reformists were jailed. Khatami found himself unable to deliver the changes he had promised. And in 2005, a hardliner named Mahmoud Ahmadinejad won the presidency, alarming reformists and the international community alike. Then came 2009. After a presidential election that many Iranians believed was stolen, millions took to the streets in what became known as the Green Movement. Protesters were beaten, shot, and arrested. A young woman named Neda Agha-Sultan was filmed dying on a Tehran street. The video spread around the world. The Green Movement was crushed. But it was not forgotten. Through the 2010s, Iran was squeezed by international sanctions over its nuclear program. Sanctions that devastated the Iranian economy and hammered ordinary citizens hardest. In 2015, a landmark nuclear deal, the JCPOA, was signed between Iran and world powers. For a brief moment, there was hope that Iran might reopen to the world, that ordinary Iranians might breathe a little easier. In 2018, the Trump administration unilaterally withdrew from the deal. Sanctions snapped back, harsher than before. The Iranian economy collapsed. Inflation soared. The currency plummeted. And the Iranian government responded to economic desperation and protest with more crackdown. In November 2019, protesters were shot in the streets. Hundreds were killed in days. Then, in September 2022, a 22-year-old Kurdish Iranian woman named Mahsa Amini was arrested by the morality police for allegedly wearing her hijab improperly. She died in custody. The outcry was unlike anything Iran had seen in decades. Women burned their headscarves in the streets. The slogan rang out, Zan Zendegi Azadi, woman, life, freedom. Young Iranians, many of them born after the revolution, risked everything. They faced bullets. They faced prison. They faced execution. The uprising was suppressed. But something had shifted. A generation had declared openly what had been whispered for decades. They did not want this system. So what is the tragedy of Iran? Is it the invasions? The Mongols, the Arabs, the British, the Americans? Is it the rulers, the shahs, the clerics, who chose power over their own people? Is it geography, the curse of sitting at the crossroads of the world, always in the path of whoever wants to control it? Or is the tragedy something more painful? That Iran has again and again produced people capable of extraordinary things, scientists, poets, reformers, revolutionaries, and then watched those people be silenced, exiled, or killed by their own governments. Mossadegh, elected democratically, overthrown by foreign powers. The reformists of 1979, who wanted freedom, crushed by the movement they helped create. The Green Movement protesters of 2009. The women burning their headscarves in 2022. The Iranian people have never stopped wanting dignity. And they have never been allowed to have it, not for long. But here is what history tells us about Iran. It endures. Cyrus rose from the plateau. Persian culture absorbed Alexander's Greeks. Persian poetry outlived the Mongols. The Persian language, Farsi, is still spoken today, a thread of continuity through 3,000 years of catastrophe. Iran is not finished. Its story is not over. The question is, what chapter comes next? And who will write it? If the past is any guide, it will be the Iranian people. It always has been. If this video moved you, or taught you something you didn't know, please share it. Iran's history deserves to be understood, not just argued about on the news. I'll link in the description to books, documentaries, and resources if you want to go deeper. And if you have family from Iran or stories connected to this history, I'd love to hear them in the comments. Thank you for watching.